Thanks very much, Sarah. It's great to be here today, and thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you especially to those men who have joined us today, because ultimately International Women's Day is about gender equality. I got very vague instructions about what I was going to talk about, so I, of course, will exercise a woman's prerogative and do what I wanted to do. And I looked at who else was going to speak and thought, well, one of the important things I need to speak about is women's role supporting agriculture in government, because the other speakers aren't going to talk about that. And perhaps the second thing I need to talk about is some women who are well progressed in their career, because most of the other speakers are more youthful. It is interesting to be the oldest person in the room, and I just don't know how it happened, because for quite a long while I was young Beth, and then suddenly you look around and all those other old people have disappeared. It's very nice to see Jeff Coots here today, because he reassured me by telling me that he's older than me. But I do think, as women in the audience, we need to be grateful for the women who've championed gender equity over the decades. Certainly when I started my working life as a high school student, it was a source of great frustration that I was paid $29 a week and the boys working in equivalent jobs were paid $64. I'm pleased to say that's not the case anymore. And similarly, we've come a long way since women working in the public sector were required to resign when they got married. The Queensland Public Sector Gender Equity Strategy was released last year, and it's a subject that's really dear to the current Queensland Government's heart. If you have a quick look on the internet at the members of the Queensland Cabinet currently, it's 50-50. In the previous Palaszczuk government, there were slightly more women than men. And there's a very strong commitment in our political leadership in Queensland at the moment to the idea that we need to represent the diversity in the population in those who make decisions for government. So the cornerstone of gender equity lies in both men and women being financially independent, having the same rights, access and opportunities, and equal access to power, decision-making and influence. I think we should hold similar aspirations for men and women who are part of the broader agriculture, fisheries and forestry sectors. In a government sense, the agriculture sector continues to be challenged by the number of women pursuing non-traditional careers in science, agricultural, engineering and technology industries. Within the department, we currently have 40% of women in agricultural science positions and 49% of women in agricultural technician positions. And there's a continuing role to challenge stereotypes, to explore career options and to embrace the opportunities that Queensland has to offer for women in traditionally male-dominated industries. We have a strong emphasis on asking the question, where does this job need to be done? And we have an all roles flex policy. Easier to say than it is to do, but we're working on it. And of course, it applies to men as well as to women. Our Gender Equity Action Plan supports female professionals having continued access to career development in their chosen field. We're not even close yet, but we are on our way to meeting the Queensland Public Service target of 50% of women in senior roles by the year 2022. So I'm one of 6 out of 18 Directors General who are female. Currently in DAF, we have 37% of women in senior roles, and we're constantly looking at our attraction and retention strategies to support women who choose to pursue these opportunities. There are barriers, and they're the barriers that are traditional for women progressing in their career. The loss of access to flexi time as you become more senior, the loss of continuing appointment as you move into contract positions, and the emphasis that many women with family responsibilities place on ensuring that they will have a secure job and a secure income going forward. Nevertheless, we're committed to building an inclusive and diverse workforce that better reflects the community we serve. I'm constantly inspired and excited by the achievements of the women who I meet when I'm out and about in the state, talking agriculture and science. I was asked to think about some of those women and talk about them today, and I chose 4 outstanding women who are well progressed in their careers. And I guess the challenge that I put to you is that we need to grow the next dozen. So 4 of my age should be turning into at least a dozen for those who are, and I'm looking around the audience, you look about 25 to me. Now, the first person who I chose to speak about was Georgie Somerset, and she's actually on the program, and she's coming, because I can't see her here at the minute. So I won't say too much about Georgie, because I'm sure she'll tell you something of her own story. But you would all know her name. She's currently the president of AgForce. She, with her husband and family, run a family cattle property at Geelong, and she's the mother of 3 young adults. I've known Georgie for at least 30 years, I guess, and I think the thing that I'd like to really emphasise about Georgie, and that you might think about when she's speaking, is that she has an absolute passion for communicating and marketing the contribution that agriculture makes to Australia's community, to its economy, and to its future. She, amongst all the senior women that I've worked with in the sector, has always had that strong passion around communicating and marketing. And it's so commonly reflected as one of the reasons why women's contribution is not recognised, that many women are uncomfortable in blowing their own trumpet. But I think it's interesting, it's so much easier to communicate and market the sector, the role, the value of the work you do, than perhaps it is to blow your own trumpet. And I think that's something that Georgie has done with enormous passion. I've worked with her in farm biz, in rural adjustment matters, in rural women matters through the Queensland Rural and Regional Women's Network, in professional development activities that she's led in the South Burnett, as a board member of QRA, the Queensland Rural Adjustment Authority, and of course most recently in her leadership role at AgForce. And that's been a passion and really an outstanding characteristic that she's brought to her role. Luckily, because I'm supposed to be clicking, somebody has actually gone on and shown you a picture. I'm sure that Georgie will have a better one. But I thought that we needed one that was out in the paddock, not a beautiful one. Marie Piccone is another person who I wanted to draw to your attention. Marie is again somebody who I've known since my university days. She worked for the department in the early part of her career. She's the managing director and owner of Mambaloo Limited, Australia's biggest mango company. Mambaloo produces mangoes at 6 locations across the Northern Territory and Queensland, and is the largest producer of Kensington Pride mangoes in Australia. The company also produces avocados and a significant volume of R2E2 mangoes, and is a committed exporter into carefully selected global markets. Actually, successfully being an exporter in horticulture has been a holy grail in Australian agriculture, probably for 20 or 30 years. Once you've filled the requirements of the Australian market, then extra production only takes the price down. We really have to be able to sell consistently high-quality products into export markets. Marie has recognised that challenge and she's taken it on. She's been recognised for her achievements. She won the 2015 National Telstra Businesswoman's Award as Entrepreneur of the Year. And in 2017, she was inducted into the Her Business Australian Hall of Fame. Mambaloo's been the recipient of the Coal Supplier of the Year in 2015 and has won many export awards, most recently the Australia-Korea Chamber of Commerce Award for Excellence in Food and Beverage in 2017. Her company is recognised for their innovative, collaborative relationship with Coles and their other partners in export markets, for an intense focus on consumers and a commitment to innovation. One of the things that I think is incredibly impressive about Marie is that she has absolutely always had a passion for excellence and for pursuing quality. So right from the days when I knew her as an extension officer, she's recognised that that's an important feature to actually move forward in the sector. And she has been relentless in chasing that. She's also been a wonderful contributor. So, I regularly run into Maria at events where she's speaking, and she's been tireless both in Queensland and the Northern Territory in championing the opportunities for horticulture, the opportunities for export, and the role of quality control and excellence. And just so that you get a sense of how this actually plays out in the numbers, Marie and her family purchased Mambaloo in 2005. With her team, they've increased yield by 300%. They've increased fruit pack out from premium levels of 20 to 30% of product to 65 to 85% of product, depending on which of their orchards they're talking about. And they've been so successful in delivering quality product overseas that her biggest issue this year, she told me, was really, well, she had two. One was that she could have easily sold twice as much product as she had, both in Korea and in the US. And the second was that she quickly exceeded the capacity of the Commonwealth Department to do quarantine export inspections because they didn't actually have enough people to be able to get to the product, and it has to be inspected before it can be sent overseas. So again, somebody who I think has been an icon of women's contribution in the sector and who has built her contribution around an absolute passion for pursuing excellence and quality. The next person I want to talk about is Wendy Craig. And you might think I only put her into this so that there'd be someone who was older than me. Wendy is really the elder stateswoman of agricultural policy-related activities in Australia. She has an incredible record of executive-level appointments in both the public and the private sector. Most recently, she was a commissioner of the Productivity Commission. Prior to that, she was the CEO of the Murray-Darling Basin Commission. From 1995 to 2000, she was the Executive Director of the National Farmers Federation. And prior to that, she was the Executive Director of the Marine Science Institute at Townsville. She's got an amazing list of board experiences, including her current roles as Chair of the Climate Change Authority, Chair of the Australian Rural Leadership Foundation, Deputy Chancellor for the University of South Australia, Chair of the New South Wales Marine Estate Management Authority, and member of the Advisory Board for the Centre for Strategy and Governance. Her previous roles, she's been President of the National Competition Council, she was a board member for Dairy Australia, the Chair of the Australian Fisheries Management Authority, and the Chair of the National Rural Advisory Council. Once again, I've been privileged to work with Wendy in a whole range of those roles, and she's currently supporting us here in Queensland as the chair of our Independent Steering Committee for the Red Imported Fire Ant program, which is the biggest biosecurity eradication program that Australia's ever attempted. Recently, we were at the Agricultural Ministers meeting down in Adelaide, and it's fair to say that sometimes new ministers don't actually understand why biosecurity is important. And a minister essentially asked a difficult question about the progress of the Red Imported Fire Ant program. It was just fantastic to have Wendy there and for her to masterfully handle both the minister's political issues and be able to provide all the facts and figures of why it's critical for us to at least attempt these sort of programs. The cost to our community in terms of damage to infrastructure, damage to industry, and impact on community life would be astounding if we weren't successful. So what I really wanted to emphasise in relation to Wendy is while she's a content matter expert, what she's really become valued for is her integrity and her understanding of governance. She really has developed a reputation as somebody who is absolutely straight as a die. She looks at the evidence, she looks at the data, she looks at the rational argument, and she gives her honest, frank opinion, and she's able to articulate that and to defend it or to put it forward in terms of her discussion with senior decision makers. So really one of the superstars, I think, of the Australian agriculture and rural sector. The next person I'd like to talk about, and the last person I'd like to talk about, is Professor Nina Mitter. Nina's now the Director of the Centre for Horticultural Science at QAFI at UQ, that's the Queensland Alliance for Agriculture and Food Innovation. But she is an example of someone who has pushed barriers in just so many directions. She's an agricultural biotechnologist. She did her early training at the Indian Agricultural Research Institute in New Delhi. She moved to Australia in 2000, so she came here as an immigrant. She progressed very quickly within our department to the role of focus team leader and principal scientist, and then was one of the inaugural staff members who moved across to UQ in that Alliance for Agriculture and Food Innovation. But she didn't move across in the field of horticulture, she moved across in the field of animal science. Because the thing about Nina is that she's a fundamental scientist. She's an amazingly innovative person, but she has a wonderful knack for being able to think about what the commercial possibilities are of the innovation that she's working on. So she was very interested initially in the applications of nanoparticles for animal vaccines. She took that interest across into an innovation that she's called BioClay, which is a medium for taking a biologically active but non-GM product into pesticides and into other agricultural medicines, which is in the process of development. And if we could get this to work, we would significantly step forward with some of our residue problems, some of our unintended consequences of putting chemicals and pesticides and medicines into agricultural systems. Much tinier quantities of active ingredient would be able to be applied right to where they're needed. So she's moved into that space, and then using her skills in stem cells and in DNA and RNA chemistry, she's also recognised that she could apply those to a horticultural problem. So most recently, she's been using plant stem cells for clonal avocado plants, and that's a game changer for the avocado industry. There's an incredible demand for avocados amongst middle-class Chinese people and others in Asia. The real bugbear in the system is that we can't grow cuttings fast enough. We can't grow the industry because we're constrained by this very practical step of actually generating new plants. And what Nina's been looking at is, can we do that another way? Can we find a way to use a new technology to jump straight past what was previously a barrier and go to a different way of operating, with a target of being able to deliver 2 million new trees annually. So She has major projects that are currently being funded by the avocado industry in that area of work. So I really wanted to emphasise Nina's career and contribution because to me she's a wonderful example of a woman in the agricultural sector making a contribution through innovation and through thinking laterally and through thinking about what is the problem, what is the blockage, and what can we do to step past it in a different way. Now, there was a suggestion that I might talk a bit about myself, but I actually think that's a little bit boring, and I've got a nice little...
Hi, I'm Professor Nina Mitter at the Queensland Alliance for Agriculture and Food Innovation. Really excited to be the inaugural director of the new Centre for Horticultural Science being established, which will come into being on 1st January 2018. I'm really looking forward to establishing this centre as a centre that encourages diversity, that builds on innovation, encourages open network of collaboration, and generates the future leaders and the young minds that can deliver to the future of tomorrow. I absolutely understand how important horticulture is. A growing horticulture is a must to feed, not only feed, but to provide nutritional security to the 10 billion people by 2030. And this is the time that we need to create that step change.
There was a bit more to that video, but I decided it would be too long if I showed it. If you ever see Nina in the room, she will always be surrounded by a tribe of young people. She's totally dedicated to the idea, as I said, of innovation and using science, but also to this idea of building the next generation. So the one quick thing that I wanted to say, just by way of closing, which really comes from my own career experience, is just to make a quick reference, since I was talking about the contribution of women in agriculture, to the role of women in development in agriculture. I have been lucky in my career to be able to work in a number of international roles, and DAF continues to be a partner in a significant number of projects which work in Australia for the benefit of Australian industries, particularly Queensland industries, but also work in a partner country. And I think we are part of a great fellowship of women in agriculture. Women and children make up a disproportionate part of the agriculture sector, and in particular of the very poor people within the agriculture sector internationally. And there is an opportunity for us in Australian agriculture through our federal government programs to make a contribution to the future roles of those women. Increasingly, we're seeing a partnership between not just straight out hunger, but hunger and nutrition. And for most people around the world who are working in subsistence agriculture, it's the woman's role to make sure that the family's fed, and it's the woman's nutrition during pregnancy and lactation that really sets small children up in those very poor families for either surviving and thriving on the one hand, or for simply not making it, which continues to be an issue for the 800 million people internationally who are food insecure. I think that's a role that agriculture in Australia has always been active in, and it's one that I hope that women in agriculture will continue to identify with and to contribute to. So thank you once again for the opportunity. I understand that there's now an opportunity to answer questions, so I'm very happy to answer any questions you might have.
So thanks so much, Beth, for that presentation. I'm glad to see that you did keep within your 25 and not the 50, as you said, so that was good. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask Beth? If you do, can you please just wait for the microphone before you do ask that question?
Hi Beth, Julie McKerrow. I'm with Trade and Investment Queensland. You won't remember me, but you lectured me at Gatton College in the early 90s.
I remembered the name.
One of the things I admired about you back then was that you were a professional woman with a young family and you were making a real go of it, and clearly you've achieved considerable success in your career. Do you have any words for those of us here today about balance in career and how to progress?
Yeah. I think that continues to be a challenge, and interestingly, of course, it's a challenge for young men as well. I am very conscious, because it happens that just outside my office I have a whole range of young departmental officers that our young male officers aspire also to have time and involvement with their young families. I used to, and I still think it's the critical thing, you really need to pick your partner well. From my perspective, I mean, I have been enormously fortunate to have a husband who also works in the sector, but who had a commitment from when I first met him to the idea that both men and women needed to have opportunities in life. And I still argue he hasn't done his share of the washing, but he certainly has done his share of lots of other things. More seriously, I think if I look at the data in our own organisation, it's quite clear that lots of people are nervous or cautious about actually using the arrangements that are available. So when I look at our, and we do regular surveys within the department, so one of the things we ask people is, are you using the working flexibly arrangements? And there are a significant proportion of people who use them. And then there's another whole group of people who say, I'm not using them because I'm nervous that a discussion about this would indicate that I'm not career-oriented, I'm not devoted to my job, etc. I guess my quick comment would be that when I had children, you didn't have any choice. 6 weeks before the baby's due date, you had to stay home. You weren't allowed to come to work anymore. And there were no return to work part-time options. So if you could afford to, because there was no maternity pay either, you saved up before you had babies so that you could survive for 12 months with nothing and still make the contributions to superannuation, because your superannuation lapsed back in those days if you didn't have sufficient cash in your bank account to be able to keep contributing to it. But in fact, people like me took a whole 12 months off. Most people now would have returned to work part-time by then. So I think we have actually made some improvements, and I'd encourage people to actually use those opportunities. I remember coming back after 12 months off with each of my children, being bitter and twisted about the fact that blokes had moved ahead while I was busy doing baby stuff. But I think looking back now, you realise that those were short periods in a whole career and a whole life. And sometimes I think the best advice to younger people is to say, well, don't be too hard on yourself. Don't be too impatient. Give it 5 years until your children are at school. Make every opportunity that you can a winner, but don't sweat it too much, because I think the system is moving in the direction of better balance. We had a big discussion yesterday. I was up in Bundaberg at a regional leadership team, and we were talking about workplace health and safety. And I think the bigger issue in our organisation is when you get into the more senior roles, and it does become difficult to keep your work life to any reasonable bounds. From my own perspective, I love the work I do, so I don't feel too bitter and twisted most of the time. Occasionally you have a bad day and you think, why did I spend 10 hours and got nowhere at all, and then got, snafu'd at the end. But mostly I love the work I do, so I don't feel overly resentful about long hours. But it is an issue when you've got children and you've got other family commitments, or older parents and other older family members. And I think that's perhaps the part of our working lives where we still haven't quite achieved the balance issue. I'd also make the comment that I don't think we've got the balance right in much of the private sector. And I have a son who runs a small business. His biggest bugbear is the unpredictability of staff and the fact that they have reasons why they don't turn up, and in a small business that's hard to manage. But once again, I see a great deal more innovation going on now than there was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So I think we're on the right track. And we just have to keep having constructive conversations about how we solve problems and how we all get to still be there in a week and a month and a year's time. Because what I don't want to see, and what we try to avoid in our organisation, is having really capable, prospective women or men falling out of the organisation in their 30s and 40s, just at the point where they're in their most valuable part of their working life.
Do we have one more quick question?
Hello, my name's Chrissy Loverick and I'm studying my PhD at the University of Southern Queensland, just at Toowoomba up here. I noticed that you were talking about a lot of retention factors with women, and I was wondering if there were also any barriers that you saw in terms of attracting women to agriculture in the first place.
I think the stats in Australia are actually very positive at the moment. The two technical areas that we employ people in are obviously people with various sorts of science qualifications, agricultural science, but other science qualifications, and vet. And if you actually look across Australian higher education institutes at the moment, they are pretty much 50-50 in most areas. That's not the case if you're talking about the real sort of maths, physics, engineering, IT area, and we have more difficulty attracting women in those areas. Our biggest attraction issue is actually about keeping people, and it is about balance, the previous question. It's also about the fact that there are opportunities sometimes in the private sector or in other government departments that pay more, and I suppose I celebrate that in a way, because at the moment I'm doing a lot of work with the CEO of the Queensland Reconstruction Authority on the flood issue that we've just had in North Queensland. As it happens, he happens to be an agricultural science graduate. Doesn't work in agriculture anymore, but it makes a heck of a difference when you're dealing with somebody in that agency who has an agriculture background. They understand much better what the issues are for the sector, and so while I go groan every time we lose a good person, if we lose a good person to another business or department where they can be useful to us, and I'd put Nina Mitter in that category. Used to be an employee, now working for the university. Marie Picconi's another one who used to work for the department, now working in the industry. What a great legacy that is. So I guess I'm comfortable with the attraction thing. I think we've got enough people going in. It is challenging, I have to say, for higher degree students, and speaking specifically to your situation, if you're a research person with a narrow research interest and you want to continue to be a research person in that narrow research interest, then it's likely that you're going to have the same problem as anybody with a narrow ambition has. You've got to find the job that's actually matching your interest. And I have spoken to lots of PhD graduates who have really become very good in their field and want to keep working in it, and that's been a challenge because there aren't enough of those sorts of jobs around. On the other hand, I really relish having people with PhD qualifications in our department, because the training that you get in a PhD is terrific training in thinking rationally, chasing a problem till you get to a solution, thinking about innovation, and those are all things we want to employ. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Beth.